The afternoon had that particular quality of English summer which the English themselves never quite trust. The sky too blue, the air too still, the roses performing almost theatrically against the old stone wall of Thwaite Manor. It was the sort of day that made one feel, quite against one's better judgment, that everything was perfectly all right. Mrs. Dorothea Holt had arranged the garden party with her customary precision. The tables were draped in white linen, anchored at the corners against any ambitious breeze by small pots of lavender. The sandwiches had been cut to identical triangles. The strawberries had been hulled. Even the bees appeared to have received some instruction, moving decorously between the foxgloves without troubling the guests. Thwaite-on-Arden was not a large village, but it was, by its own reckoning, a complete one. It had its church, its public house, its post office, managed with mild tyranny by Mrs. Fitch, and its manor, which had passed through 3 generations of Holts without any particular scandal, a record the village regarded as either admirable or faintly disappointing, depending on one's temperament. The guests arrived in the predictable order of their social confidence. Mr. and Mrs. Gerald Fenchurch came first, Gerald with his broad red face and his habit of laughing at things slightly before they were funny, and his wife Constance pale and precise beside him, carrying a small gift of elderflower cordial that nobody had requested. The Reverend Aspinall followed, dressed as though the occasion was slightly more funereal than it appeared. Dr. Hayward came alone, his wife having sent her regrets and a plate of shortbread. Young Philip Holt, Dorothea's nephew, recently returned from 18 months abroad, moved through the garden with the slightly distracted air of someone still adjusting to stillness. And then there were others. The Misses Plum, 2 sisters of indeterminate age who attended every village event as faithfully as punctuation. Mr. Aubrey Crane, the solicitor, who had handled the Holt estate for 20 years, and wore the quiet satisfaction of a man who knows where all the important papers are kept, and seated comfortably in a wicker chair near the herbaceous border, already accepting a cup of tea from the young maid with the expression of a woman who has arrived not merely at a party, but at a vantage point, Miss Jane Marple, and she was staying with her niece in the village for a fortnight, a fact which Dorothea Holt had regarded as a happy coincidence of timing when extending the invitation. Miss Marple was one of those elderly ladies who could be invited to any gathering without risk. She was pleasant, she was unobtrusive, and she never said anything alarming, or so most people supposed. She sat now with her teacup balanced on her knee, her knitting not yet begun, watching the garden fill with the comfortable industry of people performing, being at ease. Her eyes moved slowly, with the unhurried patience of someone doing a piece of fine work. It was, on the surface, the most ordinary of afternoons. Philip Holt brought her a plate of sandwiches without being asked, which she thought rather sweet. He was a handsome young man, with a quality of restlessness that the sun and the social occasion had not entirely suppressed. He asked after her health, mentioned the weather, complimented the roses, and then glanced, just once and quickly, toward the far end of the garden, where Aubrey Crane was speaking with some animation to Dorothea Holt. The glance lasted perhaps a second. It contained several things: attention, wariness, and something that in a less well-mannered young man might have been called resentment. Miss Marple noted it and accepted another sandwich. The afternoon moved pleasantly through its appointed stages. Gerald Fenchurch told a long story about a misunderstanding at a golf club. The Mrs. Plum circulated. The Reverend Aspinall found himself stranded near the radishes in conversation with Dr. Hayward on the subject of drainage, both men enduring the exchange with stoic courtesy. Constance Fenchurch sat very straight at the far table, eating nothing and watching everything, which was, Miss Marple had observed over many years, not quite the same as seeing anything. At 4:10, Dorothea Holt excused herself from a conversation and moved toward the house with the purposeful quietness of a hostess managing some domestic detail. She passed through the French doors into the sitting room. No one else followed. At 4:20, Mr. Crane went to refresh his drink at the table near the terrace and found himself in conversation with Philip Holt, which appeared to make neither of them comfortable. At 4:35, a young maid appeared at the French doors with a slightly unusual expression on her face, not precisely alarm, but the compressed look of someone managing an inconvenient discovery, and asked quietly whether Dr. Hayward might step inside for a moment. He went. He did not return. At 4:40, his voice could be heard from within the house, low and controlled, asking for someone to telephone the police immediately. The garden became, in the space of a breath, entirely different. People put down cups. Conversations ended mid-sentence. Gerald Fenchurch's expression dropped its habitual readiness for laughter. Even the roses seemed to lose something. Dorothea Holt had been found in the sitting room, collapsed beside the writing desk, quite dead. The doctor was in no doubt as to the general fact of it, but though the cause would require more examination. She had been in perfect health so far as anyone had known. She was 61 years old. She had arranged the sandwiches herself. Miss Marple sat for a moment with her teacup still in her hand. Then she set it gently on the garden table beside her, smoothed her skirt, and looked toward the house with the expression of someone who has just noticed, in an otherwise orderly piece of needlework, a stitch that does not belong. She said nothing at all, but she began very quietly to think. The police arrived from Burford in 2 cars, with the unhurried authority of people who have attended unexpected deaths before, and found them, more often than not, to be less unexpected than they first appeared. Inspector Graves was a solid, deliberate man with a notepad. He consulted frequently, and a manner that suggested he had formed most of his opinions before leaving the station. He moved through Thwaite Manor with professional efficiency, asked the gathered guests to remain available, and arranged for statements to be taken in the library, one person at a time. The guests waited in the garden because nobody quite knew where else to go, and because going home felt, in the circumstances, somehow impolite. Miss Marple remained in her wicker chair. She had at some point produced her knitting from her bag, and the needles moved with quiet regularity, while around her the garden rearranged itself into something quite different from what it had been an hour earlier. The strawberries remained on the table. The lavender pots had not moved, but the afternoon light had shifted into something longer and cooler, and the roses against the wall had taken on a different character entirely. Gerald Fenchurch was the first to speak, because Gerald Fenchurch was always the first to speak. "Heart, I should think," he said, to no one in particular, and everyone within range. She was not a young woman. These things happen. He delivered this with the satisfied nod of a man who has resolved something, and reached for a strawberry that he did not eat. "She had no history of heart trouble," said Dr. Hayward, who had returned to the garden and stood at its edge with his jacket slightly disarranged, and his usual composure not quite reassembled. "None whatsoever. I was her physician for 14 years. "Well," said Gerald, undeterred, "one doesn't always know." Constance Fenchurch said nothing, but turned her head toward Philip Holt with the particular attention of someone filing information away rather than offering it. Philip stood near the wall with his arms folded, looking at the grass. He had answered the constable's preliminary questions in a voice that was carefully level. He had not, Miss Marple observed, asked what had happened to his aunt. He had not asked where she was found, or how she had appeared, or whether she had said anything. These were the questions that people generally asked when someone they loved had died suddenly. The absence of them was not necessarily sinister. Grief expressed itself in all manner of ways. But it was, she thought, worth remembering, and the Mrs. Plum had retreated to a bench near the kitchen garden and were conducting a murmured conversation of some intensity. The elder Miss Plum, Harriet, had the expression of someone thoroughly engaged with a difficult moral question, while her sister Agnes looked simply frightened and kept glancing toward the house. The Reverend Aspinall had taken it upon himself to stand near the French doors, as though offering some form of spiritual barrier between the guests and whatever was occurring inside, which was kind in intention, if somewhat impractical in effect. By 6 o'clock, the guests had been questioned and released. They moved to their cars and their cottages and their suppers, and Thwaite on Arden absorbed the news with the quiet efficiency of a village that has had centuries of practice absorbing things. By 8 o'clock, every household in the village knew. By 9, the version circulating at the King's Head public house had acquired several additional details of uncertain provenance, including the suggestion that Dorothea Holt had been found clutching a letter, that there had been words between her and her nephew that very afternoon, and that the new kitchen maid had given notice not 3 days prior, though nobody seemed entirely sure what that last detail signified. Miss Marple took breakfast the following morning at her niece's cottage and listened. Her niece, Mrs. Cecily Wade, was a cheerful woman of 45 who kept a good garden and an excellent ear for village conversation, and who brought both to bear over the toast and marmalade. "Well, naturally everyone is saying it was Philip," Cecily said, pouring tea with the brisk energy of someone who has been looking forward to this conversation. "He's only just come back, hasn't he? 18 months away, no real explanation given. And it's no secret that Dorothea controlled the estate absolutely. He wouldn't see a penny until she chose to release it, or until—" she paused with the teapot still raised. "Until she was no longer in a position to withhold it," Miss Marple offered gently. "Exactly." Cecily set down the teapot. "And there's the matter of Mr. Crane, the solicitor. He was there, of course, yesterday. And people are saying, though I don't know how people know these things, that Dorothea had recently made changes to some arrangement or other, something to do with the estate." "Had she?" said Miss Marple, and spread her marmalade thoughtfully. "Aubrey Crane has handled Holt affairs since before Gerald Fenchurch had his hair. He'd know exactly what was in her will, and what had changed, and what it meant for, well, for everyone concerned." "And what do people make of Mr. Crane himself?" Cecily considered. "He's not popular exactly. Correct, very correct. But there's something closed about him. He's never married. He was devoted to old Mr. Holt, Dorothea's husband, and when Mr. Holt died, everyone rather expected him to step back. But instead he and Dorothea became close, professionally close," she added, with the slight emphasis of someone making a distinction, they are not entirely certain applies." Miss Marple nodded. She drank her tea. Outside the cottage window, the village was conducting its morning with studied normality. A bicycle going past, a dog being called in from somewhere, the post office opening its door with its familiar small complaint of hinges. "And Dr. Hayward," Miss Marple said, "was he quite well, did you think, yesterday?" Cecily looked at her. He seemed shaken, but then she was his patient. It's a shock, isn't it, to lose someone so suddenly? "Yes," said Miss Marple, "it is." She said nothing more on the subject, but her needles, which she had brought to the breakfast table, resumed their quiet and rather purposeful clicking. The church of St. Bartholomew stood at the north end of the village with the patient solidity of something that has outlasted several versions of the world, and expects to outlast several more. Its morning service on Sunday drew the usual congregation, which is to say, those who came from faith, those who came from habit, and those who came because it was the best way of seeing everyone at once, without appearing to have arranged it. Miss Marple came from a combination of all three, though she would only have admitted to the first. She arrived early enough to choose her position with care, third pew from the back, on the left, which offered an unobstructed view of the nave, and of everyone who entered after her. She arranged her hymn book, her gloves and her handbag with the unhurried precision of a woman settling in for something more demanding than worship. The congregation assembled by degrees. The Misses Plum arrived together and separated almost immediately, taking opposite ends of the same pew in a manner that suggested some disagreement had occurred since the garden party and not yet been resolved. Agnes Plum's eyes were slightly red. Harriet's mouth was set in the particular way of someone who has said what needed saying, and considers the matter closed. Gerald Fenchurch came in without his wife, which was unusual, and sat heavily in his customary pew with the expression of a man who has slept poorly and found the morning no improvement on the night. He did not look toward the door after he sat down, which was more unusual still. Gerald was not a man who missed an entrance. Constance Fenchurch arrived 4 minutes later, alone, and sat in the Fenchurch pew beside her husband without acknowledgement. The space between them on the wooden bench was not large. It was, however, present. Philip Holt did not come. Mr. Aubrey Crane arrived at precisely 5 minutes before the hour, as he always did, in his good dark coat. Ian took his place near the front with the composed expression of a man who has nothing to conceal, and would like that to be apparent. He did not look around at the congregation. He did not need to. Aubrey Crane, Miss Marple had long suspected, was a man who knew exactly who was in a room without the inconvenience of looking. The Reverend Aspinall conducted the service with somewhat more solemnity than the occasion strictly demanded, and his sermon, drawn from Job, with the careful emphasis of a man making a point while appearing to make a general observation, contained several references to the unknowability of Providence that were received with varying degrees of comfort by the pews. Miss Marple sang the hymns in a small, true voice, and watched. Afterwards, in the churchyard, the village performed its customary ritual of conversation, the same conversations largely that were conducted in the churchyard every Sunday, overlaid this week with something additional, something lower and more careful in register, like a familiar piece of music played in a minor key. She found herself beside Dr. Hayward, near the old yew tree. which had presumably been there since before anyone's particular tragedy, and would continue to be there after. "A sad occasion," he said, meaning the sermon, or the week, or both. "Very," Miss Marple agreed. She paused. "You knew her well, I think, Mrs. Holt?" 14 years as her physician. He looked at the church rather than at Miss Marple. She was a sensible woman, careful about her health, not the sort who ignored things. "And there was nothing," Miss Marple began, with the slightly vague air of someone merely continuing a thought. "Nothing," he said with a firmness that was perhaps 1 degree more emphatic than the question required. "Nothing that would have predicted this. I've told the inspector as much." He turned then and offered a brief professional smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "The post-mortem will clarify things, of course." "Of course," said Miss Marple pleasantly. He excused himself with the purposeful movement of a man who has somewhere specific to be, though Miss Marple noted he moved not toward the gate, but toward the far side of the churchyard, where the older stones were, and where no one in particular was standing. She filed this away without apparent interest, and turned to find Agnes Plum at her elbow. Agnes was the younger of the 2 sisters by 3 years, and the softer by a considerable margin. She had the slightly urgent manner of someone who has been wanting to say something for some time, and has finally found themselves beside the appropriate person. "Miss Marple," she said, and then stopped, as though the sentence had required more preparation than she had given it. "It is a difficult week," Miss Marple offered, with the gentle patience of someone opening a door and standing back. "Yes." Agnes glanced toward her sister, who was speaking with Mr. Crane at a sufficient distance. We were fond of Mrs. Holt, you understand. Harriet more than I, perhaps. They were friendly." She paused. "Or had been, Miss Marple repeated, with just enough softness to make it a question. "There was some difficulty, recently. I don't know precisely. Harriet doesn't confide every guess, but something had happened between them. And Harriet was not herself for several weeks." Agnes stopped again. "I only mention it because I don't wish anyone to think, that is, if it were to come out some other way. I think you are very sensible to speak of it," Miss Marple said warmly. "And I think you are also a very loyal sister." Agnes blinked, apparently unsure whether this was reassurance or something more complicated. "She didn't do anything wrong," Agnes said with sudden quiet urgency, "whatever it looked like." Miss Marple patted her hand once, with great gentleness. "No," she said, "I expect not." She watched Agnes return to her sister with the slightly relieved posture of someone who has unburdened themselves of something heavy, without, perhaps, noticing that they had handed it to someone else entirely. Miss Marple walked home through the churchyard alone, past the old yew and the older stones, thinking about the things that had not been said, which were, as she had always found, considerably more informative than the things that had. Inspector Graves had, by Monday morning, arrived at a conclusion. One could tell by the way he moved through the village, with the slightly accelerated purposefulness of a man who has answered the question and is now attending to the paperwork. He had spoken again with Philip Holt on Sunday evening, and again on Monday at the station in Burford, and the shape of his thinking had become, to anyone watching carefully, quite apparent. Philip Holt was 29 years old, the only surviving relative of Dorothea Holt, and the sole beneficiary of an estate valued, so village arithmetic had it, at somewhere between substantial and considerable. He had been abroad for 18 months, a period during which he and his aunt had communicated, by Philip's own account, infrequently. He had returned to Thwaite-on-Arden 6 weeks ago, taken rooms at the King's Head, and had been seen at the manor on several occasions, sometimes by invitation, and sometimes, apparently, not. The post-mortem had returned a result that made the matter considerably less comfortable than a heart attack would have been. Dorothea Holt had died of cardiac arrest, yes, but brought about by a quantity of digitalis glycoside inconsistent with any prescription she had been given. And inconsistent, Dr. Hayward confirmed with a grey and careful face, it with any treatment he had ever administered. She had, in short, been poisoned. Quietly, efficiently, and with something that might easily have been overlooked in a woman of 61 who kept a well-ordered medicine cabinet. The village received this information on Monday afternoon, and experienced something between horror and a dark, suppressed satisfaction that it immediately felt guilty about. Miss Marple heard it from Cecily over lunch, delivered with the slightly breathless energy of significant news, only partially concealing genuine distress. "Poisoned," Cecily said, setting down the soup ladle with more force than intended. "With digitalis, which is, well, it's foxglove, isn't it? And she had them growing along the entire back wall. Many people do," Miss Marple said. "They're very handsome plants. But to think that someone at that party—" Cecily sat down. "Someone who ate her sandwiches and drank her tea and then—" She stopped. "It is very dreadful," Miss Marple agreed, with a gravity that was entirely genuine. "They'll arrest Philip, won't they?" It was not quite a question. "Inspector Graves strikes me as a thorough man," Miss Marple said carefully. "He will pursue the evidence that presents itself. Philip inherits everything. He was there. He had— well, everyone says there was a disagreement, that last week, between him and Dorothea. Something about the estate, about money that he felt was owed to him." Cecily shook her head. "And he spent 18 months somewhere that nobody seems to be entirely sure about. When people ask him directly, he changes the subject." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "He does, doesn't he?" She said it in the tone of someone confirming a detail, and returned to her soup. She encountered Philip Holt himself that afternoon, by the simple method of walking past the King's Head, at the hour when he habitually sat in the small garden at the side with a book he rarely appeared to be reading. She had observed this habit on 3 previous occasions and found it instructive. A young man who comes every day to sit outside a public house and stare at the middle distance is generally a young man with something particular on his mind. "May I?" She indicated the second chair with the mildest of gestures. He stood immediately, with the automatic good manners of someone properly raised, and said, "Of course, please," and would she like anything brought out, which she declined, and they sat for a moment in the easy silence of 2 people who do not know each other well enough to feel the pressure of filling it immediately. "I imagine," Miss Marple said eventually, "that this week has been very hard." Philip looked at his closed book. "The inspector thinks I did it." "Inspectors tend to think in straight lines," Miss Marple said, without particular criticism. "It is generally useful, and occasionally a disadvantage." He glanced at her with something that might have been surprise. "You don't think I did?" It was not quite a question, and she did not quite answer it. "I think," she said, "that you are a young man who came home after a long time away, and found things rather different from what he had hoped to find them, and I think that is a great deal to manage." Philip was quiet for a moment. A bicycle passed on the lane. Somewhere in the pub behind them, a glass was set down on wood. "She'd changed her will," he said finally. "I found out 3 weeks ago. Crane told me, not meaning to be kind about it, I think. She'd redirected a significant portion. To a charitable trust of some kind. I was still named, but— He stopped. It was less, considerably less, and she wouldn't discuss it. Every time I raised it, she became formal, like talking to a stranger. That must have been painful. I wasn't angry about the money. He said it quickly, with the urgency of someone who has said it several times and found it still doesn't sound as true as it is. Or not only that, it was the closing off, as if she'd decided something about me and wouldn't say what. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And you have no idea what she might have decided? He met her eyes for the first time properly. I thought perhaps Crane had said something. He was always— I never quite knew what he was to her. More than a solicitor. But what, exactly? I couldn't tell you. No, said Miss Marple thoughtfully. I don't suppose you could. She rose, thanked him pleasantly for the company, and walked back along the lane towards Cecily's cottage with the unhurried step of someone enjoying the afternoon air. The foxgloves, she noticed, were particularly fine along the manor wall. Tall, deep-throated, magnificently poisonous. Everyone admired them. Everyone knew what they were. Which meant, she thought quietly, that the knowledge of their properties was no kind of distinction at all. The inquest was opened and adjourned on Tuesday, as these things customarily were, when the police required more time and the coroner required more facts. It lasted 40 minutes and produced nothing of comfort for anyone, which is perhaps the most that can be said of inquests in general. Miss Marple did not attend. She spent the morning instead in Dorothea Holt's garden. This had been arranged with a quietness that Miss Marple was rather good at arranging things. She had spoken the previous evening with Mrs. Turnbull, the manor's housekeeper of 11 years, a compact and watchful woman who had taken the death of her employer with a grief that expressed itself, as such grief often does in capable people, through an intensified attention to domestic order. The house was being kept exactly as it had been. Nothing moved, nothing disturbed, nothing permitted to suggest that the household had lost its centre. This, Miss Marple understood, was both loyalty and necessity, and she had approached it with appropriate delicacy. She had asked very simply whether she might walk in the garden for a little while, as the roses were so very fine at this time of year. Mrs. Turnbull, who had met Miss Marple twice previously at village events, and formed the impression of a gentle, harmless elderly lady with a genuine appreciation for horticulture, had seen no reason to refuse. Miss Marple walked in the garden for 40 minutes. She looked at the roses. She also looked at a great many other things. The terrace at the back of the manor was flagged in old limestone, warm and slightly uneven, and with a low stone balustrade along its southern edge, beyond which the garden descended in a series of gentle levels toward the kitchen garden wall. The garden party had been arranged across the upper terrace, and the first level below it, connected by 3 broad steps. Miss Marple stood on the terrace and reconstructed the afternoon with the methodical patience of someone returning to a piece of work after an interruption. The drinks table had stood to the right of the French doors. She could see the faint rectangular shadow where it had sat, the grass slightly compressed. The chairs had been arranged in clusters. She could place most of them from memory, though the garden staff had tidied since. She walked to the French doors and looked through the glass into the sitting-room beyond, which was as Mrs. Turnbull's vigilance had left it, ordered, hushed, and exactly so. Then she turned and looked at the terrace from the perspective of someone standing inside, looking out. From that angle, the drinks table was immediately to the left of the doorway. Anyone passing through the French doors would pass within arm's reach of it. Anyone standing at it would have their back, largely, to the house. She noted this. She said nothing about it. She walked on. It was the tray that she kept returning to. Not the tray itself. She had not seen the tray in its original position, and by the time anyone had thought to look carefully, it had been moved inside and washed, because Mrs. Turnbull ran a house in which trays were not left standing. But it was the moving of it that interested her. She had established, through the gentle and apparently aimless conversation at which she was considerably practised, that the young maid, Ellen, 17, earnest, and currently in a state of suppressed distress that made her rather more forthcoming than she might otherwise have been, had brought a fresh tray of cups to the terrace at approximately 10 minutes past 4. She had set it on the drinks table, removed the used cups from the earlier arrangement, and gone back inside. At that point, there had been, by Ellen's account, 2 cups already set out and unused, set out in advance, as was Dorothea Holt's habit, for guests who had not yet helped themselves. Ellen had placed the fresh tray beside them and gone in. Dorothea Holt had gone inside at 10 past 4. At 20 past 4, Philip Holt and Aubrey Crane had been standing together near the drinks table. At 4:35, Ellen had been sent to fetch the doctor. None of this on its own was remarkable. What was remarkable? What Miss Marple had extracted from Ellen in the course of a sympathetic conversation about the difficulty of the week was something the girl had mentioned almost as an aside, with the self-deprecating air of someone confessing to a minor domestic failure. When Ellen had gone to clear the terrace table later that evening, she had found the arrangement not quite as she had left it. The 2 unused cups that she had set to the right of the tray had been moved. They were now on the left. One of them had a faint ring on its base, the kind left by a small amount of liquid that had pooled and dried. Someone had picked up one of those cups, had held it, or placed something in it, or both, and had then set it back down, in the wrong position. A small thing, the kind of thing that meant nothing if you were not looking for it, and a very great deal if you were. Miss Marple stood at the balustrade and looked out at the garden, which was continuing its summer business with admirable indifference to human events. The foxgloves stood in their row, The roses performed against the stone wall. A thrush was doing something determined in the herbaceous border. The cup had been moved. It was not where Ellen had put it, which meant that someone, at some point between 20 past 4 and 4:35, had handled it. Miss Marple thought about hands, about the deliberateness required to move something and then replace it, about the particular kind of person who, having done something that must not be noticed, would carefully restore the appearance of order, and in doing so, disturb it in a different, smaller way. It was, she thought, a very precise kind of carelessness. She thanked Mrs. Turnbull warmly on her way out, and said the roses were quite exceptional this year, which they were. The village had by Wednesday settled into the particular rhythm of a place that has something very serious on its mind, but has not yet found a satisfactory way of addressing it directly. Conversations began on one subject, and arrived by routes of varying indirectness at the same destination. The weather was discussed, and became the garden party. The garden party became Mrs. Holt, Mrs. Holt became the question of who and why, and when, and then someone would remember themselves. And the conversation would retreat to safer ground, leaving behind it the faint, uncomfortable residue of things half said. Miss Marple found this residue rather more useful than the things that were said outright. She took her afternoon tea on Wednesday at the King's Head, which served a reasonable pot and offered, from its small front parlour window, an unobstructed view of the lane and the post office opposite. She was not, strictly speaking, watching for anything in particular. She was simply present, which was a different thing, and considerably more productive. It was there that she witnessed the conversation between Aubrey Crane and Constance Fenchurch. They met on the lane outside, apparently by accident, though Miss Marple had lived long enough to be cautious about apparently. Constance was returning from the direction of the post office with a small parcel. Crane was walking from the direction of the manor, where he had presumably been attending to whatever professional necessities attend upon an estate whose owner has died suddenly and under investigation. They stopped. They spoke for perhaps 4 minutes. Miss Marple could not hear the words, but she had long since learned that words were only one part of a conversation. Crane's posture was controlled, as always, but his head was inclined in a way that suggested he was listening to something he had not expected to hear. Constance's hands holding the parcel tightened once, her chin lifted by a degree. She said something brief and final in the manner of someone closing a door, and walked on without looking back. Crane stood for a moment where she had left him. Then he continued in the direction of his office on the High Street, at a pace marginally slower than his usual. Miss Marple drank her tea. She called upon Constance Fenchurch the following morning. This required no particular invention. Constance was known to keep a fine cutting garden, and had previously offered, at a village event some months prior, to share some of her sweet William divisions. Miss Marple arrived at the Fenchurch house with a small trug and the mild, appreciative air of a woman entirely focused on horticulture. Constance received her in the garden with the careful composure of a woman who had been composing herself, one suspected, for rather a long time. She was perhaps 50, fine-featured, with the kind of controlled stillness that could be mistaken for serenity by those who did not look closely enough. Miss Marple looked closely enough. They discussed Sweet William for a few minutes with genuine attention. Then, in the way of things, the conversation found its own level. "It has been a very difficult week," Constance said, cutting stems with the precise, unhesitating movements of long practice. "Very," Miss Marple agreed, "though I think perhaps it had been a difficult few weeks before that for some people." Constance's shears paused for only a fraction of a second. "I suppose that depends on the person. Gerald has known Mrs. Holt for many years, I think. Since before we married. 23 years. Constance laid the stems in the trug with careful attention. Thwaite-on-Arden is a small village. Everyone has known everyone for a very long time. And sometimes, Miss Marple said gently, long familiarity becomes complicated." There was a silence. In it, a blackbird made its uncomplicated announcement from the garden wall. "Gerald admired Dorothea," Constance said in the particular tone of someone using a word that is doing the work of several other words. "She was a capable woman. Interesting. After Richard Holt died, she managed everything herself. The estate, the tenancies, everything. People respected that." "And Gerald respected it particularly," Miss Marple said with the lightest possible emphasis on the adverb. Constance looked at her. It was a direct look, rather different from the careful management of the previous few minutes. "You are very perceptive, Miss Marple." "I am very old," Miss Marple replied pleasantly. "It amounts to much the same thing." A small silence. Then it was not. It had not been anything for some time. If it had ever been anything at all. Constance turned back to the cutting bed. But there was an understanding between them. Gerald helped with various things over the years, practical things, and I think she stopped. "You think he may have expected some acknowledgement of that," Miss Marple said, "in practical terms." "The will was changed," Constance said quietly. "We knew that much. Crane let it be known, not directly, but he has his ways of communicating what he chooses to communicate, that Dorothea had made revisions. Gerald had certain expectations, not enormous, but certain. Her mouth was precise. They were not met. "I see," said Miss Marple. "That is not a motive," Constance said with sudden sharpness. "No, indeed," Miss Marple said warmly. "It is simply a circumstance. The world is full of circumstances that lead nowhere at all." But as she walked home with her trug of Sweet William, she thought about Gerald Fenchurch, his loud laugh and his early arrival, and his reaching for the strawberry he did not eat. She thought about a man whose expectations had been quietly disappointed, by a woman he had long believed to be, in some sense, some unspoken sense, obligated to him. And she thought about the drinks table, positioned as it was, an arm's reach from the French doors, and about who, at 4:20, had been standing nearest to it. She had not yet asked Gerald Fenchurch a single question. She thought it might be time. It was Harriet Plum who changed everything, though she did not intend to and would not for some time. I understand that she had. Miss Marple had been expecting something from that quarter. Agnes's anxious disclosure in the churchyard, the fractured friendship, the unspecified difficulty between her sister and Dorothea Holt, had sat at the back of her mind like a loose thread in an otherwise tidy piece of work. Not central, perhaps, but present. And in Miss Marple's experience, loose threads had a way of connecting to things one had not initially thought to examine. She encountered Harriet on Thursday morning at the small lending library that operated 3 days a week from the back room of the village hall, staffed by volunteers of varying enthusiasm. Harriet Plum was among the more enthusiastic, and could be found there most Thursday mornings, with the proprietary satisfaction of someone in their proper element, though Miss Marple required a book. She was not particular about which one. Harriet was a tall, angular woman of 60, whose manner suggested she had spent a considerable portion of her life being more intelligent than the people around her, and had made a reasonable peace with this. She received Miss Marple with the measured warmth of someone who is privately glad of the company, but will not make a performance of it, and recommended Ngaio Marsh with the confidence of a woman whose recommendations are generally sound. Miss Marple accepted it. She turned it in her hands. She remarked that it was rather a sad week for the village, wasn't it? Harriet's expression shifted in the way that expressions shift when they have been carefully arranged and are disturbed from inside. "Yes," she said, "it is." "You were friendly with Mrs. Holt," Miss Marple said. "I believe you had known each other some years." 15 years. Harriet aligned a stack of returns with unnecessary precision. "We served together on the Church Restoration Committee, and various other things. It is hard," Miss Marple said, "to lose a friend of long standing." "Yes," a pause, "though we had been less close recently. "These things ebb and flow," Miss Marple offered, with the gentle neutrality of someone leaving a door open rather than pressing through it. Harriet looked at her with the shrewd appraisal of a woman deciding something. Whatever she decided, it appeared to come down in favour of speaking, because she set down the book in her hands and said more quietly, "She wrote me a letter 3 weeks ago. I had not told anyone because I did not know what it signified, and one does not wish to introduce complications where they may not be relevant." Miss Marple waited. "She wrote to say that she had become aware of something concerning in the management of the estate. She did not specify what. She said she had been reviewing documents, old documents from the years following Richard's death, and had found certain irregularities that she intended to address." Harriet paused. "She asked me, as a friend, to be aware that she was doing so. I thought at the time it was a precaution of some kind, as if she wanted someone outside the immediate circle to know." "A sensible precaution," Miss Marple said, "if one is contemplating a confrontation with someone inside that circle." Harriet looked at her steadily. "It would have to be someone with long access to the Holt finances. Someone trusted absolutely, and over many years. She did not say the name, she did not need to." "Have you told Inspector Graves?" Miss Marple asked. "I went yesterday afternoon." Harriet's voice was composed, but something behind it was not. He was attentive. "He has applied for access to the estate's financial records. Crane's firm is cooperating apparently, though—" She stopped. "Though Mr. Crane's cooperation under these circumstances may be more carefully calibrated than it appears," Miss Marple said. Harriet looked at her with a new attention, as though reassessing something. "Agnes always said you were simply a sweet old lady who liked knitting." "Agnes is very kind," Miss Marple said. She walked from the library with the Guy Marsh under her arm, and a considerably altered picture in her mind. The outline had shifted, or rather, it had not shifted so much as deepened, the way a landscape changes when the light moves and reveals features that were always present but insufficiently illuminated. Aubrey Crane, 20 years managing the Holt estate. The trusted solicitor, present at every significant moment of the family's financial life, with access to every account, every arrangement, every document. A man who had remained close to Dorothea after her husband's death. Professionally close, Cecily had said with that careful emphasis. A man who communicated, as Constance had noted, what he chose to communicate, and in the manner he chose to communicate it. Dorothea had found something. Something in the old documents. Something that pointed backward through 20 years of careful, trusted management to a person who had taken advantage of absolute confidence and believed with reasonable justification that he had done so invisibly. Until Dorothea looked. And then she had written a letter to a friend. Not to the police, not yet, but to a friend, as a form of quiet insurance. The act of a careful woman. A woman who wanted someone to know she was looking before she confronted the person she had found. She had confronted him at the garden party. That much Miss Marple now felt rather certain of. The private conversation between Dorothea and Crane, which several guests had noted without remarking on, because such conversations at such events were not unusual, had been that confrontation, or its beginning. And Crane had been at the drinks table at 4:20. Miss Marple paused at the lane's end and looked back at the village hall, the church, the quiet street with its unchanged facades. She thought of the cup that had been moved. She thought of a man who was very, very careful about the appearance of things, and she thought that she would need to be considerably more careful than he was if she intended to do what she now believed she needed to do. Miss Marple spent Thursday evening writing a letter. This was not unusual. She was a faithful correspondent, and her niece's cottage provided a writing desk of adequate proportion and an ink supply that Cecily replenished without being asked, having learned over several visits that her aunt's letter-writing was one of those activities that appeared recreational and was not. She wrote to her nephew Raymond, who was reliably slow in responding. She wrote to a friend in Lymington about a matter of no consequence. And then she wrote a third letter, shorter than the others, which she sealed and addressed and placed not in the post, but in her cardigan pocket. She also made, on Friday morning, a telephone call. Cecily was in the garden during this call, which was not accidental. Aubrey Crane's office occupied the ground floor of a narrow Georgian building on the High Street, between a small bakery and the estate agents, which had the slightly ironic quality of geographical arrangements that occasionally presents itself in English villages without anyone having planned it. The office was orderly and oak-panelled and smelled of paper and a particular furniture polish that spoke of long-established habit. A young woman of efficient appearance managed the front desk. Miss Marple arrived at 11 o'clock on Friday morning without an appointment, which was a minor impropriety of the sort that elderly ladies are generally permitted without censure. She asked with the mild confidence of someone who does not anticipate refusal whether Mr. Crane might spare her 10 minutes on a small personal matter. Crane received her within 5 minutes, which told her something. A man with nothing to consider does not calculate whether to keep a visitor waiting. He was standing when she entered, which was correct and courteous, and gestured her toward the chair opposite his desk with the smooth professional hospitality of a man entirely at ease. He was, she thought, a very accomplished performer, not in the showy sense, but in the deeper, in more dangerous sense of a man who had so thoroughly practiced the appearance of composure that it had become almost indistinguishable from the real thing. Almost. Miss Marple, I hope you're well. A distressing week for the village. Very distressing, she agreed, settling into the chair with the slightly effortful manner of an elderly woman managing her joints. I hope I'm not inconveniencing you. I know you must be very occupied with the estate. There are matters to attend to, he said, though everything is necessarily on hold pending the investigation. He folded his hands on the desk. The gesture was composed. His eyes were entirely watchful. Of course. She opened her handbag with the mild rummaging of someone locating something specific amid general disorder and produced a small envelope. I wonder if you could help me with a rather trivial question. I've been sorting through some papers for Cecily, my niece, and I came across a document relating to a property matter from some years ago. A Thwaite-on-Arden property, as it happens, which is why I thought of you. She placed the envelope on the desk between them. I wondered whether you had any record of it. The name on the document is Holt, which may be coincidence, but... She left the sentence pleasantly unfinished. Crane looked at the envelope. He did not reach for it immediately, which was the first response she had been watching for. A man with nothing to fear reaches for a document. A man managing his reactions pauses. He paused for perhaps 2 seconds. Then he picked it up, opened it, and read what was inside. The envelope contained a single sheet, on which Miss Marple had written, in her neat, elderly hand, a series of numbers that meant nothing. Account references she had invented that morning, plausible in format and entirely fictitious in substance. Below them she had written a date, March 1987, and a name, R. Holt. She watched his face. What she saw took approximately 4 seconds to pass across it and was quickly governed. But it was there, and she had been looking for it, not guilt precisely, because guilt was a broad and various thing. What she saw was the specific, concentrated attention of a man rapidly calculating what this document was, whether it was genuine, what she knew, and what she intended. It was recognition. The recognition of a man who has built something carefully over many years and has just heard, in an adjacent room, a sound he cannot immediately explain. He looked up from the paper with an expression of polite puzzlement. "I'm afraid I don't recognize these references. The date is rather far back. My predecessor handled most of the estate matters before 1990. I could look into it if you like." "Oh, there's no urgency," Miss Marple said warmly. "It may well be nothing at all. I simply thought, given recent events, that anything touching the Holt estate might be worth mentioning to someone who knew it properly." A fractional pause. "Recent events are in the hands of the police." "Quite so," she agreed. "Inspector Graves seems very capable." She rose with the slightly laborious movement she had perfected over several decades, as a reliable producer of diminished watchfulness in others. "I won't take more of your time. Thank you so much for seeing me." "Not at all." He came around the desk. Another calculation, she thought. The decision to accompany her to the door rather than remain seated. "If you do have concerns about documents, Miss Marple, it's always best to bring them directly to the proper authorities." "Yes," she said, "I have always found that the best course." She smiled at him. He smiled at her. She walked back down the high street in the mild Friday sunshine, her handbag over her arm, and her heart beating with the particular quality of controlled alertness that she had felt before, in St. Mary Mead, in hotels, on trains, when something she had suspected had quietly confirmed itself in the eyes of another person. He knew exactly what those numbers were not, which meant he knew precisely what they could have been, and Miss Marple did not go to Inspector Graves immediately. This was not procrastination. It was rather the recognition that what she had was not yet in a form that a practical and evidence-minded policeman could use. She had an observation, a reaction, and a great deal of accumulated understanding of human behavior, none of which would satisfy a man whose professional world was organized around demonstrable fact. She needed one more thing, not proof precisely, but the piece that would show Inspector Graves where to look for his proof and make the looking unmistakable. She thought about it through Friday afternoon and into the evening, while Cecily talked about her garden, and the radio played something orchestral in the background, and the light changed in that long, golden, and unhurried way it has in English summers, when the day finally consents to become evening. By 9 o'clock, she knew what the piece was. On Saturday morning she walked to Thwaite Manor and asked with the gentle persistence that was one of her more reliable instruments to speak with Mrs. Turnbull. The housekeeper received her in the kitchen, which was where Mrs. Turnbull was most herself, a large stone-flagged room that smelled of bread and beeswax, presided over with a quiet authority that reminded Miss Marple of certain women she had known in St. Mary Mead, who ran their households like small, precise governments. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," Miss Marple said. "You're not," said Mrs. Turnbull, in the tone of someone who would say so regardless, and whose kitchen was nevertheless clearly arranged around the expectation of undisturbed industry. She set the kettle on and stood at the counter with her arms folded in the manner of a woman prepared to be helpful within certain limits. "I wanted to ask you," Miss Marple said, settling at the kitchen table with the comfortable naturalness of someone who has sat at kitchen tables all her life and finds them considerably more instructive than drawing rooms, "about the afternoon of the garden party, specifically about Mrs. Holt's movements before she went inside." "I've told the inspector." "Yes, of course you have," Miss Marple said warmly, "and very thoroughly, I'm quite sure. I only wondered about one particular thing that may not have seemed important at the time." She paused. "Did Mrs. Holt receive any note or message during the party? Something that might have been passed to her, or left for her?" Mrs. Turnbull looked at her with the appraising attention of someone deciding whether a question is innocent. Then something shifted. "Ellen mentioned something," she said slowly. "I'd not thought much of it. She said that just before Mrs. Holt went inside, just before, maybe 2 or 3 minutes, she'd seen Mr. Crane speak quietly to her, not a long conversation. And afterwards Mrs. Holt looked purposeful, Ellen said, as if she'd been reminded of something she needed to attend to." "Purposeful," Miss Marple repeated. Ellen's word. She noticed it because Mrs. Holt had that particular expression she got when something needed doing. Mrs. Turnbull's voice softened fractionally. "She was always like that. A thing needed doing, and she went and did it. Yes," Miss Marple said, "I believe she was exactly like that." She folded her hands on the table. "And the study, Mrs. Holt's study, where she kept her household documents, that is also on the ground floor. Next room along from the sitting room. They connect. And the filing cabinet where she kept the estate papers. Would that have been locked, ordinarily?" "She kept it locked, yes. But she had the key on her person. Always. Little brass key on her keyring." Mrs. Turnbull paused. The inspector noted the keyring in his inventory, everything accounted for. "Of course," Miss Marple rose. "One last thing. The connecting door between the sitting room and the study. Which side does it lock from?" Mrs. Turnbull blinked. "The sitting room side. You can lock it from the sitting room, and to keep the study private when there are guests about." "I see," said Miss Marple quietly. "Thank you, Mrs. Turnbull. The bread smells absolutely wonderful." She went to Inspector Graves that afternoon. He received her in the small room the police had been using at the village hall with the patient, slightly guarded, courtesy of a man who has been visited by helpful members of the public before, and found the experience variable. He was not unkind. He simply had the look of someone who has already assembled his picture and finds additional pieces mildly disruptive. Miss Marple sat down, folded her hands, and talked for 20 minutes. She began with the cup, Ellen's observation, the repositioning, the dried ring. She moved to Harriet Plum's letter, the irregularities in the estate documents, the 20 years of trusted access, as she described her visit to Crane's office and what she had seen cross his face in the 4 seconds before he composed himself. She explained about Constance Fenchurch, and what she had said about the will's revision, and what that revision suggested about Dorothea's state of mind in her final weeks. A woman who had discovered something, who had quietly begun to act on it, who had used the will as a first instrument of displacement before she was ready to confront the whole. Then she described what she believed had happened at 4:20. Crane had spoken to Dorothea, not to make conversation, to tell her there was something in the study she needed to see immediately, some document, some confirmation of the very irregularities she had been investigating, perhaps something he had himself prepared for precisely this occasion, and she had gone inside, purposeful as Mrs. Turnbull's kitchen ran. She had gone to the study. The connecting door would have been unlocked. The party was in the garden, the house apparently empty. But she had not reached the study. She had stopped in the sitting room, at the drinks tray that stood inside the French doors, and poured herself the cup of tea she had not had time for during the party. The cup that had already been prepared. The cup that had been standing on the tray since 4:20. When Crane had returned to the terrace, he had moved those 2 prepared cups to the left of the tray, to the position Ellen had found them, because the one he had prepared was now gone, used and in Dorothea's hand. The remaining one, identical in appearance, was harmless. But it needed to be where the used one had been, or the absence would be noticed. He had moved them with great care. He had moved them into exactly the wrong position. Inspector Graves, Miss Marple observed, had stopped looking patient some time around the middle of this account, and had begun writing. "The financial records will show it," she said. "I suspect over a period of years, perhaps beginning shortly after Mr. Holt died, when the estate was at its most vulnerable, and Crane's access was at its most complete. Dorothea discovered it through old documents. She was going to act, and he knew she was going to act because she had changed the will. She had already begun to diminish his influence over the estate's future. He understood that the confrontation was imminent. He could not wait for it." Graves set down his pen, and he looked at her for a long moment, with an expression that was no longer patient or guarded, but was, instead, the expression of a man who has just seen the shape of something he had been standing too close to read. "The financial records," he said. "The financial records," she agreed. She picked up her handbag. "I imagine Mr. Crane is a man who kept very tidy books," she added, rising. "The question is simply whether the tidiness concealed the irregularities, or whether, under sufficiently careful examination, it reveals them." She walked to the door and paused. "In my experience, Inspector, when a very careful person makes one small mistake, the kind they never expected anyone to look for, you generally find there are others. Careful people believe their own systems, that is, ultimately, their vulnerability." She left him with his notes and his newly complicated picture, and walked home in the late afternoon light, which had gone from gold to something quieter and more considered. The foxgloves along the manor wall had begun to drop their lower blooms. It was that point in the season. Aubrey Crane was arrested on Tuesday morning. The manner of it was, by all accounts, entirely without drama, which was, Miss Marple thought, appropriate. He had been collected from his office at 9:30 by Inspector Graves and a constable, had said nothing beyond requesting the opportunity to telephone his professional association, and had walked to the waiting car with the composed bearing of a man who had, perhaps, been waiting for a particular kind of conclusion for some time, and the young woman at the front desk had stood at the office window and watched the car until it turned the corner, and then had sat down at her desk and remained there for 20 minutes doing nothing, which was unlike her. The village absorbed the news by midday. It did so quietly, which was also appropriate, and with the particular subdued quality of a community that has had its suspicions pointed in one direction for a week and must now entirely reorient itself. Philip Holt's name was not exactly cleared. These things move at their own pace, but the angle of speculation had changed, and with it the angle of the glances that followed him along the lane. He was seen at the manor that afternoon, standing in the garden for a long time, doing nothing in particular, and this was reported with the careful sympathy of people who feel they owe a small apology but have not yet found its precise wording. The financial examination took several days, and was, as Miss Marple had suggested it might be, illuminating in proportion to its thoroughness. The irregularities stretched back 19 years to within 14 months of Richard Holt's death, which placed their beginning in the period of maximum vulnerability and minimum scrutiny. They were not enormous in any individual instance. They were rather the work of a very intelligent and patient man who had understood that small, consistent abstractions over a long period would accumulate to something considerable while remaining, at any given moment, below the threshold of obvious alarm. The total, when the accountants had finished their work, it was significant. It was also, Miss Marple reflected, precisely the kind of patient long-term accumulation that revealed a great deal about its architect. The preference for slow, safe, invisible gain over rapid reward, the deep confidence in one's own invisibility, the particular vanity of the clever person who believes that because they are more intelligent than those around them, they are therefore safer. Crane had managed the Holt estate for 2 decades with genuine competence. The tragedy, if one were inclined to be generous, which Miss Marple was within limits, was that he had been good at his work. He had also, quietly and incrementally, stolen from it. The two facts had coexisted for 19 years, each providing cover for the other, until Dorothea had looked at the old documents, which she had done, Miss Marple suspected, not from suspicion, but from the methodical instinct of a careful woman putting her affairs in order, the kind of domestic thoroughness that attends to the back of the filing cabinet as well as the front. She had found something small. She had pulled the thread. She had, with characteristic purposefulness, followed it. And Crane had known. Because Crane, who had spent 20 years reading the texture of the Holt household, could read Dorothea's particular quality of purposefulness as precisely as Mrs. Turnbull could. He had seen it coming in the changed will. He had confirmed it in the conversations she had not quite had with him, but had been preparing to have. He had acted, as careful and frightened people sometimes do, from a kind of cold, premeditated desperation. He had prepared the cup. He had manoeuvred her inside. He had returned to the garden and stood near the drinks table, making conversation with Philip Holt, who had been, in his unknowing way, a useful alibi and a convenient distraction simultaneously. The foxgloves had been entirely incidental. He had not needed the garden. He had a dispensary connection through a client he had served for years. A small and irregular arrangement that the accountants found, eventually, folded inside a different set of numbers. Miss Marple called upon Harriet Plum on Wednesday afternoon. Harriet received her in the sitting-room with good tea, and the composed expression of someone who has been through something difficult and has not yet fully taken its measure. Agnes hovered briefly in the doorway, was gently redirected by her sister, and retreated. "You knew," Harriet said. It was not an accusation. It was the statement of someone locating the shape of a week that had not made sense, and finding that it now did. "I began to suspect," Miss Marple said, "there is a difference. The letter Dorothea sent me, that was what pointed you." It was one of several things. Miss Marple set down her cup. She was a very sensible woman, your friend. Sending that letter was exactly the right instinct. She wanted a witness to her knowledge, not evidence, not accusation, simply the fact that someone outside the circle knew she was looking. It was, in a sense, the most intelligent thing she did in those final weeks. Harriet was quiet for a moment. The room held its ordinary objects with the slightly heightened presence that rooms sometimes have after grief, the clock, the books, the curtains carrying more weight than their fabric. She ought to have simply gone to the police, Harriet said. Yes, Miss Marple agreed, though we say that easily about our friends and their situations. In practice, it is difficult to go to the police about a man one has trusted for 20 years on the strength of some numbers that might yet prove innocent. She wanted to be certain first. She was that kind of person. Careful, Harriet said. Careful, Miss Marple agreed, as he was. Two careful people, each aware the other was moving, each waiting for the right moment. She paused. He was simply willing to act before she was. Harriet absorbed this. Outside, the afternoon moved through its familiar arrangements. A car passing, a child's distant voice, the village conducting its persistent, ordinary business. "And Philip?" Harriet asked. "Philip will be quite all right, I think," Miss Marple said. "He is a young man who came home looking for something he could not name, in a house that had changed without telling him why. That is not an easy position, but the house is his now, and the naming can begin." She stayed another 20 minutes, finished her tea, admired the room's aspect toward the garden, and took her leave with the warm unhurriedness of someone who has nowhere pressing to be, and considers this a form of good fortune. The fortnight was nearly done. Cecily had mentioned this at breakfast on Thursday, with the slightly over-casual air of someone who hopes a thing will not be confirmed. And Miss Marple had said yes. She thought she ought to get back to St. Mary Mead by the weekend, and there had been a small silence of the affectionate kind between two people who are fond of each other, and have spent a comfortable time in each other's company, and do not need to make a ceremony of its ending. The morning was clear, with that particular quality of early autumn light that arrives in England sometimes in late August, uninvited and exquisite, the sky a degree paler, the shadows longer by a fraction, the season turning its page so quietly that one notices it first in some peripheral way, a coolness at the edge of things. Miss Marple put on her good cardigan and walked to Thwaite Manor. Philip Holt met her at the gate. He had been expecting her, he said, which she found neither surprising nor presumptuous. He had the look of a young man who had slept better than he had been sleeping, and the slightly cautious hopefulness of someone in whom a long tension has been released, and who is not yet certain what to do with the space it has left. He walked with her into the garden, and they went along the rose border in the mild morning, and the conversation found its level easily, as it had before at the King's Head, with no particular pressure from either side. "The solicitors are sorting things out," he said. "It will take some time. There are various complications arising from the financial situation, things to be untangled." He paused. "I keep thinking I ought to feel angrier than I do. About Crane, about what he took from her." "Anger has its own timing," Miss Marple said. "It tends to arrive punctually, whether invited or not." He smiled briefly at the roses. "She wasn't an easy woman, my aunt. I don't want to. In light of everything, I don't want to make her something she wasn't. She was strict, and she could be cold, and the business with the will." He stopped. "But she was trying to be fair. That's what I've come to understand this past week. The changes to the will, she was already uncertain about Crane, already beginning to see something, and she was trying to manage it carefully, trying not to move too fast." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "I believe that is exactly right." She moved things away from his influence before she was ready to confront him directly. The charitable trust, the redirection of certain accounts. She was protecting the estate from him, incrementally, while she gathered her certainty. He was quiet for a moment. I was an incidental casualty of that process, and the reduction in my portion was collateral to a different operation entirely. Miss Marple nodded. She may well have intended to restore it once the matter was resolved. Perhaps. He said it without bitterness, which she thought well of him for. Or perhaps not, either way. He looked at the house, at its old stone face, its mullioned windows, its complete and settled presence in the landscape. It's mine now. That carries its own weight. It carries a great deal of weight, Miss Marple said, but weight, properly managed, can be useful. He looked at her with the direct, clear gaze of someone who has revised their assessment of a person and found the revision comfortable. You knew it was Crane from quite early, didn't you? It was not quite a question, and she gave it not quite an answer. I thought it was likely. There is a difference between likelihood and knowledge. What made you think it likely? She considered. They had reached the end of the rose border and turned instinctively back along it. The manor wall was warm in the morning light. There is a kind of person, she said, who has organized their entire life around the management of appearances, not from wickedness necessarily, often from a deep and genuine belief that they are better equipped than others to determine how things ought to be. They are frequently right about this in the practical sense. They are good at what they do. They are trusted, and the trust is not entirely undeserved. She paused, but this same quality, this belief in their own management, means that when something threatens to expose them, they respond not with panic, but with method. They do not run. They arrange, and in the arranging, they make the kind of small, precise errors that only someone looking for the texture of the thing, rather than its surface, is likely to find. Philip was quiet, absorbing this. The cup. The cup, she said. He restored the appearance of the tray very carefully. He was methodical about it, but he restored it to his own sense of order, not to Ellen's. He had been making that kind of substitution for 19 years, his own arrangement in place of the original, so smoothly executed that the original was forgotten. He simply could not help applying the same instinct even there. They stood for a moment near the foxgloves, which had dropped most of their blooms now, and stood in their green height, still handsome, still quietly dangerous, waiting for the season to take them back. What will you do, she asked, with the garden? He looked at it. Keep it, I think, all of it, even these. He glanced at the foxgloves with the expression of someone making a considered peace. They were here before any of this. They'll be here after. Yes, said Miss Marple. They will. She took her leave shortly afterwards at the front gate, with the warm brevity of someone who dislikes prolonged goodbyes on principle. Philip thanked her, simply and without excess, and she received his thanks in the same spirit. She walked back through the village in the clear morning, past the post office, past the church, past the King's Head with its hanging baskets just beginning to turn, and thought, as she sometimes did at the end of these things, about the texture of human nature, which did not change, and which was both the most troubling and the most instructive thing she knew. People were, in the end, remarkably consistent. The vain were vain in their crimes as in everything else. The careful were careful in ways that eventually exposed them. The loving were reckless from love, and the cold were methodical from coldness. And if one had simply paid attention to who people were, not who they appeared to be, or who they wished to be, but who they consistently, patiently, revealingly were, then the rest followed with a kind of sad inevitability. She had seen it in St. Mary Mead 100 times. The village was always different and always the same. The names changed, the houses changed, the seasons turned through their sequence, but people, in their essential arrangements, remained faithfully themselves, which was, she had long decided, both the tragedy and the grace of it. Cecily had the kettle on when she arrived back at the cottage. There was toast and marmalade and the particular quality of domestic mourning that requires nothing of anyone except presence and warmth. Miss Marple sat down, removed her cardigan, and accepted her cup with the quiet gratitude of someone who has been out in the world, and found it, once again, exactly as complicated and exactly as legible as she had always known it to be. She picked up her knitting. Outside, Thwaite on Arden continued its mourning, the bicycle on the lane, the dog in someone's garden, the post office with its familiar complaint of hinges, unchanged, and, in the way that mattered, restored. The foxgloves stood in their row and said nothing. They never did,